Hey folks, hey guys, it's this week's Torah portion is Shemini, and I'm doing this week's show all on my lonesome because my co-host is not feeling well. So we'll see how I do on my own. It's not as easy not having anyone to bounce things off, but I'll be taking your questions via Facebook and email, and let's see what happens. So this week's Torah portion is Shemini. That means Leviticus chapter 9 to Leviticus chapter 11, verse 47. And there are two main themes in the laws in this week's Torah portion. There are sections of law on kashrut, and there are sections of law on the ritual sacrifice in the temple. And there's one story. There's a story in there about Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, who bring a strange fire to God. And God doesn't like it. He burns them up and kills them. So there are many rabbinic interpretations about what does this story mean. And one primary rabbinic interpretation is that it means that Nadab and Abihu, Aaron's sons, were drunk when they brought the strange fire before God. I just love this concept of strange fire. I mean, there are just so many possibilities. What is strange fire? I'm the son of a heretic. My father was a very controversial Seventh-day Adventist theologian and preacher, and he was dismissed from the Seventh-day Adventist Church ministry in 1980 for holding certain heretical views about what will happen at the end of the world, the cleansing of the sanctuary as predicted in Daniel 8:14, I believe. And so from a traditional Seventh-day Adventist perspective, perhaps my father's a heretic, so I'm a son of a heretic. And I have some of those heretical genes, so I just have this yen to know, what was the strange fire that Nadab and Abihu brought before God. My uncle, my dad's brother, was also a heretic in his own way. He was a communist, and he was always arguing with people. He was always getting fired. He was always fracturing friendships. Something of a Ford trait, latching on to certain beliefs and then sacrificing everything for them, including the people around you. And my Uncle Val, who just died a couple of years ago, had a saying, keep your mouth shut and your bowels open. And us Fords often talk about the importance of keeping your mouth shut and listening to other people, because we have a tendency just to run roughshod over others in the pursuit of our ideals and our ideas and the things that attract us. And we don't listen enough. So can I listen to this week's Torah portion? It's Shemini. And God lays down a lot of demands on the Jews in this week's Torah portion. And so it just made me think, what would happen if God had laid down these demands on a less intelligent and less diligent and less industrious group of people? Like, unless you're a fairly elite group, you cannot possibly execute all of God's commands or even execute them at the level that the Israelites did. So what if God had laid down these demands, say, and given the Torah to Mexicans or to Africans or to Arabs? The world would look very differently. For instance, if God gave the Torah to Mexicans, there would probably be 200 million Jews in the world, because then the people who would have received the Torah, executed the Torah, would have become the Jewish people. I just can't imagine in my mind any other group of people taking the Torah and executing the Torah. So the complexity, specificity, and the industry mandated by this week's Parsha and the Torah in general makes me think that even these ancient Israelites 3,200 years ago had an above average IQ, because industry and persistence tend to correlate with IQ. Also, morality, which depends on the ability for abstract thought, again, depends on high IQ. So I'm wondering if these Israelites 3,200 years ago had an above average IQ to be able to wrestle with the demands of the Torah. And I'm thinking about Jews over the past 3,000 years as they've had to wrestle with the demands of the Torah and with the demands of leading a Jewish life. Leading a Jewish life tends to be expensive. You're expected to send your children to Jewish schools. You have to take off 8 days for Passover and 8 days for Sukkot, and you have to take the Sabbath off every day. So it's a very demanding way of life. And what happens to the people who can't keep up? There are strong incentives for them to fall away from Judaism and perhaps take up a less demanding religion. So 500 years ago, you didn't really have a choice to be secular. You had to belong to a religion, and in Europe, the dominant religion was Christianity, and in the Arab world, the dominant religion was Islam. So for most of the last 2,000 years, if Jews were going to fall away from Judaism, they had to either become Christians or Muslims. So there is one theory that the smart Jews reproduced and kept their children in the tribe, while the less intelligent Jews had a more difficult time finding a match, had a more difficult time keeping up, and they had more incentives perhaps to fall away and to take easier routes such as Christianity and Islam, which are much less demanding than Judaism. Perhaps this has had a eugenic effect on Jews. So Jews talk a lot about tikkun olam. So with almost any Torah portion, you'll hear Jews talking about improving the world, using the Torah to make the world a better place. Now, most Jews who use the phrase tikkun olam are left-wing secular Jews who don't observe Judaism, and their way of making the world a better place is through pushing for left-wing politics, which usually means empowering minorities at the expense of the white majority. So for most secular Jews, when you talk about tikkun olam, it means recycling, it means more government welfare, more health care and dental care for poor people, more social workers for poor people. It means more gay rights, more affirmative action. It means fighting on behalf of oppressed minorities such as Blacks, Latinos, women, gays, transsexuals. For many secular Jews, that's what tikkun olam means. And Jews who are not Orthodox vote overwhelmingly for the Democratic Party. So north of 80% of non-Orthodox Jews would vote for the Democratic Party. And most Orthodox Jews, however, tend to vote Republican. And traditional Orthodox Jews strongly tend to vote Republican. Now, with every group in the world that I know of that has spirit, Jews tend to think of themselves as the very center of the world, the key group that makes the world go forward. And I expect that Germans feel the same way about themselves, Greeks, Japanese, Chinese, Australians, Blacks, Muslims. I think every group tends to think of itself as the center of the world. I think every group tends to think of itself as morally superior. So I remember when I lived in Australia, when I'd watch the Australian news, it's always kind of underlain with the supposition that Australians had a superior morality to the rest of the world. If the rest of the world would only be more like us, then the rest of the world would be better off. When I was in England, I also noticed this widespread assumption, just taken for granted by the English, that English morals and English television were simply superior. And for a while there, they even thought that English soccer was superior to the rest of the world, and perhaps even English cricket. Then I grew up a Christian, and again, it was simply taken for granted that being Christian was the best identity one could take on, and that Christianity was the world's greatest moral system. And there was very little doubt about that. It was just assumed that to be a Christian was a good thing, and that the Christian perspective on the world was the most true and the most moral. So I don't think Jews are uniquely ethnocentric or self-centered if they view themselves as God's chosen people. I think every people with spirit believes that they're specially chosen by God or by the divine, or by fate, or by history to play some pivotal role. Tom Wolfe gave a famous and deservedly so lecture about this in 2006, about how every group thinks of itself as the center of the world. And I remember I grew up a Seventh-day Adventist Christian, and when growing up, I'd look out at the world, I'd take it for granted that if non-Christians out in the world simply became Christian, that most of the world's problems would be solved. And while Jews don't seek to make the world Jewish, we naturally tend to think that Judaism and being Jewish is the superior moral way of looking at the world. And we feel very comfortable critiquing the 99% of the world that is not Jewish. Now, we in turn don't like being critiqued by the Goyim, just like the Japanese don't like being critiqued morally by non-Japanese, and Muslims don't like being critiqued by non-Muslims, and blacks don't like being critiqued by non-blacks. And Christians tend not to like being morally evaluated by outsiders. But we can overcome this inherent bias of thinking that our group is the center of the world and the one with the most moral acuity by stepping outside of ourselves at times and put ourselves in the shoes of another and look at the world from another person's point of view. So I grew up a Christian, so it's pretty easy for me to look at the world from a Christian perspective. I've had black friends and black acquaintances, so I feel like I can put myself in their shoes and see the world from a black perspective. I've had a Chinese girlfriends. I feel like I can put myself in a Chinese point of view and see the world from that perspective. I have friends who are Japanese. I think I can see the world from that perspective. So with a little moral imagination, we can look at Torah, we can look at Jews, we can look at the world from another person's point of view. And that's something that I try to do on my blog and in my Facebook postings and in these Torah talks. Another thing we can do with our moral imagination is that we can look at Jewish history and understand where the actions of Jews have contributed to anti-Semitism. We can learn to master our own history and to see what role we have played in our own suffering. So it's not an easy perspective, but certainly something that we can do. And a great book, if a Jew wants to go about this very difficult task, is by Albert S. Lindemann. It's called Esau's Tears, Anti-Semitism and the Rise of the Jews. An example of this is, think about Black History Month. Blacks don't regard Black History Month as a time to take stock of where their own feelings have contributed to anti-Black sentiments. It's usually a time of victimology, when Blacks look at the horrible things that have been done to them by non-Blacks and rejoice in the accomplishments of Blacks. And that's also the point of view of every group of which I'm aware. You look at the wonderful things that your group has done, and you boil with indignation at the horrible things that outsiders have done to your group. But very rarely do you take stock of where your own group's failings, or not even failings, where your own group's actions and traits and behaviors and customs and rituals have put it at odds with those around them, thus causing conflict. Different groups have different interests, and those interests inevitably clash. For instance, Jews have an interest in maintaining the safety and the prosperity of the Jewish state of Israel. Arabs and Muslims have an interest in removing the Jewish state of Israel because that used to be dominantly Arab land. I think up to the 1920s, the land was 3/4 Arab. And so from an Arab perspective, all these Jews who were coming into Palestine were like poisonous snakes who were set on taking over the land and stealing it from the Arabs, stealing it from the Muslims, and making it Jewish. And then Israel became a reality in 1948, and Palestinians have had to live with the humiliation of being kicked out of land that they regarded as being theirs, and seeing the Jewish state of Israel become increasingly prosperous, outdoing all the Arab states around it. That's an unbearable humiliation. So it would make sense to me why, from an Arab perspective, a Palestinian perspective, you just wage continual war using different means to try to destroy the Jewish state of Israel. I think someone with a strong and healthy Muslim identity, Arab identity, and Palestinian identity is going to have some incentives to dislike Jews and to dislike the Jewish state, because the interests of Jews and the interests of Muslims and the interests of Arabs and Palestinians, they clash, they collide. And when they collide, there's inevitably conflict and often tragedy and death. So I'm thinking, and Jews being in the desert. And I'm thinking, would Jews have been better off if they had been more diverse? What if they'd been 10% Mexican, 10% Japanese? What if they'd been 10% Arab, 10% Palestinian, 10% Muslim? Would the Jews in the desert be better off? You know, that's really hard to believe. You have approximately 2 million Jews have been exiled from Egypt, according to the Torah perspective. And they're facing a very tough path. And what can they do? How can they survive in the desert? It's hard to imagine that the Jews in the desert would have been better off if they'd been more splintered, if they'd been more diverse, if they'd subscribed to different religions, different political systems, had different ethnicities, different races. How would the Jews have been stronger if they'd been more fractured? They'd had less genetic similarity, they'd been less related, if they'd looked more foreign to each other, if they'd had more foreign ways, if they smelled differently. I've noticed I've had a very wide range of girlfriends that Chinese smell differently, and Japanese smell a little bit differently, and Koreans smell a little bit differently, and blacks smell a little bit differently, and Persians smell a little bit differently, that each group of people smells a little bit differently. Each group has its own customs, its own food, its own rituals, its own way of doing things. And so it seems impossible to imagine that the Israelites would have been stronger if they'd been more diverse. And yet you often hear this rhetoric, our diversity is our strength. But I can't think of any examples where diversity is a strength. It certainly wouldn't have been the strength for the Israelites wandering in the desert. And so I don't see why it's a strength for Israel to have 2 million Muslims in their midst who want the Jewish state dead. I don't see why it's a strength for America to have about 100 million non-whites in its midst who don't have the same loyalty to the founding fathers, to the Constitution, to the historic American nation, which is genetically European. I don't think Japan would be made stronger if it imported 1 million Mexicans or 1 million Black Africans or even 1 million Koreans. More diversity only breeds more conflict. Just take a Black neighborhood and you see some whites driving around looking to move in, and it'd be an understandable Black reaction to say, there goes the neighborhood. Now, what if you had some white gays moving in to gentrify a Black neighborhood? Blacks may understandably want to keep their neighborhood Black, may not want Mexicans moving in, may not want Japanese or whites or gays moving in. They may want to keep their neighborhood Black. So too, I understand if whites want to keep their neighborhood white, or Jews want to keep their neighborhood Jewish. One of the ways that Jews created Jewish neighborhood is by Jews agreeing in that neighborhood not to sell their home to non-Jews. So technically this may be against the law, but Jews have been able to get away with it. Who's going to force you to sell your home to a non-Jew? And so that's one of the ways that Jews have built up community. So it seems to me to make sense that all groups would want to build up a strong in-group identity and to build up their community without interference from outsiders. I remember a few years ago, I was in this cycle where I was writing a lot about my relationships. And I was in the middle of a very tumultuous relationship. I broke up with this particular woman about 5 times over the course of a year. And I was writing about some episode from our relationship in my writing class. And my teacher suggested that I write about things from my girlfriend's perspective. That just like changed my life. And I sat down and started writing things out from my girlfriend's perspective. And that really helped me to see a different point of view on things. And then my girlfriend and I would get together and she wrote out the beginning of our relationship from her perspective. And it was a great writing exercise, and it's a great exercise in a moral imagination to put yourself in the point of view of someone else. And be warned, it's very destabilizing of your prejudices. So some people complain that past shows have been a little too edgy. So I thought I'd toss out a family-friendly question this week by asking, what sort of Jew might Hitler have made? So Hitler became obsessed with Jews. When I went to UCLA at age 22, I also became obsessed with Jews. You can then take this obsession with Jews in many different directions. Like I took it into converting to Orthodox Judaism. Hitler took it into executing a Holocaust of European Jews. But just imagine Hitler, he knew a lot of Jews in Vienna. His mother's doctor was Jewish, and he noticed that Jews were very dominant in Vienna's art scene. So what if he'd taken his collision with Jews and their alien ways and his fascination with Jews, and instead he turned it in a direction of, I wonder why this group of people are so high achieving in the art world, for instance, where I would like to be high achieving. What can I learn from them? Do I want to join them? Is there anything here I want to emulate? Is there anything here that I admire? And just imagine that he'd taken that fascination and turned it into conversion to Judaism. So we all have our evil impulses. We all have a little bit of Hitler inside of us. We all have a Yetzer Hara from a Jewish perspective. That means an urge to do evil. What if we take that urge and we channel it in a productive direction? There's an author by the name of George Gilder who wrote a book called The Israel Test, and he attributes anti-Semitism primarily to envy at high Jewish achievement. And he says the great Israel test is, how do you relate to people who excel you, who outdo you? Do you envy them, or do you resent them and hate them? So just imagine that Hitler took his resentment, his envy of Jews, and he turned that into fodder for, say, converting to Judaism, or simply turned it into fodder for high artistic achievement or high achievement in some non-destructive realm. And I've met people who remind me a little bit of Hitler, whether they're Christians or Jews, where they are so single-mindedly devoted to a cause that they don't relate to me as a human being. Instead, they just relate to me as fodder for Christ or fodder for Torah. And such people, they're not interested in others as human beings. They're only interested in them as to what utility they can have for assisting the cause. It's been very rare that I've gone to a Sabbath meal, been invited to Shabbat dinner, and the hosts have no interest in me as a human being except as fodder for Torah. But I have experienced that on occasion. I notice this primarily among Balei Teshuva. That means returnees to Orthodox Judaism, as opposed to those who grew up Orthodox Jews. So the overwhelming majority of Orthodox Jews were raised that way. But you do have some people who either converted to Orthodox Judaism or came from a non-Orthodox Jewish upbringing and became Orthodox. And often these newcomers to Orthodox Judaism tend to be more zealous, and some of them have the tendency to look at other people as just fodder for the cause of Torah, as fodder for the cause of the Jewish people. And it's not a very pleasant interaction when you run into this buzzsaw. I remember a lot of people like that when I was growing up a Seventh-day Adventist. I remember evangelists would be talking to my dad, and they talk about how many people they saved in their evangelical swing through the Philippines or through Russia or through South America. And for these evangelists, it just seemed like everybody was just fodder for Christ. And now it sense from the comments to many of these videos that we have a lot of white nationalists watching our shows. And perhaps we even have some little Hitlers in the making, perhaps kids raised in swastika swaddling. So, what does this week's Torah portion say to the incipient homicidal maniac in all of us? Just leave that as an open question. Some people are no doubt morally transformed by religion, be it Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism. I think for me, it's hard to step outside yourself and evaluate what made a big moral difference in my life. I think for me, it was 12-step work. And what got me ready for 12-step work was learning the Alexander technique. And the Alexander technique is about learning to notice how you respond to stimuli and then let go of those responses that don't serve you. And so when I was able to start stopping many of my immediate responses, I was able to just pause and come to greater peace with myself. And then I started noticing that I had all these addictive qualities in principally my love life, that I'd been repeating the same sort of relationship over and over and over again. And the common denominator to all these relationships was me. And they all had a certain pattern. They'd start off really hot and they were exciting. And then I'd become dependent on the woman, or she would become dependent on me. Usually often I was the codependent. Sometimes I was the counter-dependent. So a counter-dependent is the opposite of codependent. Men tend to be counter-dependent, meaning as long as they're getting laid and paid, they're okay. But they don't want too much intimacy. Codependent tends to get overly invested in the other person at the expense of your own welfare. And so I saw these patterns in all of my relationships, and I saw some addictive qualities that I had, what's called process addictions to certain processes. I remember in high school, I developed an addiction to gambling, and I had to completely cut that out after I graduated high school. I swore I'd never gamble again with my own money. Someone gives me $5 and tells me to go play with slot machines, that's not a problem for me. But I can't gamble with my own money because I would just get too high from gambling and I wouldn't make good choices. So by learning to stop my habitual reactions to stimuli, I was able to pause, start to notice more things about myself, such as my emotional addictions. That led me to 12-step work and many, many years of psychotherapy. And I think that these things have done more for my moral development and to make me an easier person to be around than my previous 20 years of Judaism. So earlier in the broadcast, I talked about Nadav and Avihu and how God struck them down because they were playing with strange fire in the temple. And there's a halacha, a Jewish law that develops out of this. And that halacha says you can't poskin a shaila if you're drunk, meaning a rabbi cannot answer a question about Jewish law if he's drunk. Because when you're drunk, you tend to not have the same judgment as when you're sober. So I grew up a Seventh-day Adventist. We didn't drink. No alcohol in the home I had growing up. And I think I have a genetic predisposition that does not like alcohol. And so I'm not comfortable in a room full of drunk people. I mean, as an Orthodox Jew, at Simchas, people tend to drink. And also, Orthodox Jews don't tend to have the same demands for body space that white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, such as myself, grew up with. So they tend to be much more closely packed. They tend to drink more at Simchas, tend to be more sweaty because it's against Jewish law to take a hot shower on a Jewish holiday or on the Sabbath or on Yom Tovim, Jewish holidays such as Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. So it's not easy for me coming from a Seventh-day Adventist upbringing, with the sort of aloof, standoffish WASP mentality. And then suddenly I'm surrounded by a room full of hot, sweaty, drunk, Hasidic Jews. It's a bit of a challenge. So the Pope just recognized the Armenian genocide, something that the Anti-Defamation League and many other pro-Israel groups failed to do for many years. So why did many Jewish groups not recognize the Armenian genocide? Because they wanted to protect Israel. Israel does not have many allies in the Middle East. And for a number of years, such as the 1980s, early 1990s, Israel developed decent relations with Turkey, which is a Muslim state, and not easy to achieve. And so to not harm the relationships between the Jewish state and Turkey, a Muslim state, Jewish groups would not draw attention to the Armenian genocide, which happened around 1918, 1919 at the hands of the Turks. About 300,000 Armenians approximately were slaughtered. So the Jewish group's evil because they think strategically. They think about what's good for their group. No, not at all. I think every group should do this. If you ignore the consequences of your choices to just live out an ideal, that's not necessarily moral. I think part of being moral is looking at what will be the consequences of my actions. So every nationalism has a victimology, and every victimology has a nationalism. So the more nationalistic you become as a Black or a Chinese or a Japanese or a Jew or a Serbian or a Croat, the more you're going to think about how your people is being victimized by outsiders. The more strongly you develop your in-group identity, the more likely you are to be suspicious of outsiders, to have discomfort around outsiders, to even have enmity towards outsiders. So when Jews cry, Jewish groups cry, never again about the Holocaust, and we must educate people about genocide, that's done often unconsciously, but within the rubric of thinking what is good for my group. And so if publicizing the Armenian genocide is not good for my group at a certain time, then you don't publicize the Armenian genocide, even if it conflicts with your broader appeal. So if you're Armenian or you belong to some small group, you're never going to have much success pushing your agenda in the wider society if you frame it narrowly in terms of what's good for your group. So of course, Jewish groups or Armenian groups are going to talk about worldwide universal moral values. And so that's how it is with, never again to genocide and never again to the Holocaust. It's usually framed in terms of universal moral values. But of course, Jews, like every group, should put their own welfare first. There's a great book about this. It's called The Holocaust in American Life. It's written by Peter Novick. And he notes that until the 1960s, the Holocaust is regarded as something that the Nazis had done. But starting in the 1960s, the Holocaust became a type of sacred religious focus for many non-Orthodox Jews. And then this religion of the Holocaust kind of expanded the blame for the Holocaust so that all Germans got the blame for the Holocaust, and then all white Christians in Europe, and then all Christians generally. And so this is fueled among some Jews, some secular Jews, chiefly of Eastern European origin, kind of this anti-white, anti-Goyim animus, because they come from a background of hundreds of years of just living in mutual loathing with the Goyim around them, whether in Russia or in Poland. Jews and the non-Jews in Eastern Europe tended not to get along very well, tended to hate each other. Now, as a convert to Orthodox Judaism, it's much easier for me to see all the reasons why Jews in Eastern Europe hated the non-Jews around them. But if I invest a little moral imagination, do a little research, then I can also come to understand how Poles and Russians and Serbs and Lithuanians had their reasons for resenting and disliking the Jews in their midst. By contrast, Orthodox Jews don't tend to build many special commemorations of the Holocaust. Holocaust is not central to the focus of traditional Orthodox Judaism. In fact, it gets no more attention, perhaps even less attention, than the destruction of the ancient temples in Jerusalem, which happened 2,600 years ago and 2,000 years ago. So if you grow up as a Jew with the idea that the Holocaust is central to your Jewish identity, you're likely to have a lot of distrust and dislike and even enmity and hostility towards the Goyim, who are white non-Jews, because you'll grow up thinking, you know, look at what these people did to my people. They killed 6 million of us. As opposed to the initial 1950s reaction to the Holocaust, which was to blame it on the Nazis. You know, not all Germans, just those particular Nazis who carried it out. So it's whom is Lenin's question. Like, who benefits and who gets hurt? So we have all these museums of the Holocaust in America and in the world, but very few, if any, museums to victims of communist genocide. So why is that? Who benefits and who gets hurt? Like, why does the tens of millions of people who've been slaughtered by communism, why does that get so much less attention than the 6 million Jews who were killed in Europe during World War II? So I'll just leave that as an open question. And I think it's a legitimate question. And from my perspective, we need more memorialization of the millions of non-Jews who were slaughtered by communism. Then we need more and more Holocaust museums. So when you have a victimology, that fuels your nationalism and that fuels your strong in-group identity. If you can build up your sense that outsiders may well, you know, wish to wipe you out, that brings about an apprehension and a desire to sacrifice for your group and a kind of group bonding that can be very powerful for developing strong in-group identity. But if it leads to hatred and contempt of outsiders to your group, that can then fuel persecution of your in-group. So strong in-group identity that is not rooted in reality, that is just unhinged resentment against outsiders, doesn't necessarily serve the long-term interests of your in-group. So I hope I'll be back next week with my co-host. I've had to do this week's show alone. Thanks for watching.